The words hit me like a physical blow. Your brother deserves it more than you do. My mother's voice was calm, almost casual, as if she was discussing the weather instead of destroying my world. I was sitting in my childhood living room, surrounded by the faded floral wallpaper and family photos that suddenly felt like lies. My parents had called this meeting to discuss their will. I never imagined it would end with me walking out with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart. Full of rage, my father nodded in agreement, his weathered hands folded neatly in his lap. We've thought about this carefully, and your brother has always been more responsible. He needs the support more than you do. The irony wasn't lost on me. My brother Jake, sitting smugly in the corner chair, hadn't worked a steady job in 5 years. He'd dropped out of 3 different colleges, crashed to cars, and had been bailed out of financial trouble more times than I could count. Yet somehow, in my parents' eyes, he was the responsible one who deserved everything. The house we were sitting in, the one where I'd spent countless hours helping my father repair the roof and paint the shutters, where I'd cared for my grandmother during her final months while Jake was off partying in Vegas, was now his. The family business that I'd worked at every summer since I was 14, learning every aspect from bookkeeping to customer service, would go to Jake, who'd never shown any interest in it. Even my grandmother's antique jewelry, pieces she'd specifically told me she wanted me to have, were being given to Jake to do with as he saw fit. I remember staring at my parents, searching their faces for some sign that this was a cruel joke. My mother avoided my eyes, suddenly fascinated by her wedding ring. My father cleared his throat and shuffled through the legal papers as if they contained stock reports instead of the complete erasure of my place in the family. The lawyer, a family friend who'd known me since childhood, looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. The silence stretched until I finally found my voice. Can I ask why? The question came out smaller than I intended. I was 32 years old, a college graduate, with a steady job and a clean record, yet I felt like a confused child begging for an explanation. My mother's response would replay in my mind for years to come. You've always been so independent, so capable. You don't need us the way Jake does. He's more sensitive, more vulnerable. We worry about what will happen to him when we're gone. Asterisk, asterisk, if this story resonates with you, please leave deserves it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe. For more real-life stories that will touch your heart, asterisk, asterisk. The drive home from my parents' house was a blur of tears and disbelief. I lived in a small apartment across town, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I'd been proud of my independence, of not having to rely on my parents for support like Jake did. Now that independence felt like a punishment. I'd been too successful for their love, too strong for their concern. I pulled into my parking space and sat in the car for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened. That night, I called my best friend Sarah, who'd been like a sister to me since high school. She was furious on my behalf, using words I won't repeat here. This is absolutely insane, she said. You're the one who visited them every Sunday. You're the one who handled their taxes when they got too complicated. You're the one who drove your mom to every doctor's appointment when she broke her hip. What has Jake done besides take? Her anger felt validating, but it also made the reality sink in deeper. This wasn't some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. This was a deliberate choice my parents had made, a final judgment on my worth as their child. I'd spent 32 years trying to earn their approval, and I'd finally learned it was never going to come. The next few days were a haze of phone calls from relatives who'd heard the news. Most were shocked and supportive, telling me stories of their own family disappointments and urging me not to let this define me. My Aunt Linda, my mother's older sister, was particularly vocal. Your mother has always been blind when it comes to that boy, she said. Ever since he was little, she's made excuses for him, but this is beyond the pale, even for her. Was my cousin Mike's reaction that really opened my eyes. He was Jake's age, and they'd grown up together like brothers. I'm not surprised, he said quietly. Jake's been bragging about this for months. He told me at Christmas that your parents were going to take care of him in their will because he needed it more. He even joked about how you'd probably flip out when you found out. The betrayal deepened. Not only had my parents made this decision, but Jake had known about it for months and had been celebrating behind my back. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering where I'd brought gifts and tried to be the dutiful daughter, Jake had been sitting there knowing he'd already won the ultimate prize. The smugness in his expression during the meeting suddenly made perfect sense. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake replaying conversations, looking for signs I'd missed, trying to understand when and why my parents had decided I was worth less than my brother. I thought about the time I'd given up a promotion that would have required relocating because I didn't want to move away from family. I thought about the money I'd lent my parents during the recession that they'd never paid back. I thought about the weekends I'd spent helping them with yard work while Jake was nowhere to be found. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't really about the money or the house or the business. Those were just symbols of something much deeper. My parents had looked at their two children and decided that one was worthy of their legacy and the other wasn't. They decided that years of responsibility, reliability, and love counted for nothing compared to Jake's neediness and charm. A week after the devastating meeting, Jake called me. Voice was artificially cheerful, as if nothing had changed. Between us, "Hey sis, want to grab lunch? I know things are probably weird right now, but we're still family, right?" The casualness of it, the complete lack of acknowledgement of what had happened, sent me over the edge. "Family?" I said. "Is that what you call this? You knew for months what they were planning, and you said nothing. You sat there and watched them destroy me, and you smiled about it." His response revealed everything I needed to know about who he is. Really was. "Look, I didn't ask for this. But Mom and Dad made their choice, and honestly, I do need the help more than you do. You've got your act together. You've got a job. You're fine. I'm still figuring things out. I'm still figuring things out." At 30, after a decade of my parents funding his figuring it out process, he still saw himself as the victim who deserved everyone else's sacrifice. Asterisk, asterisk, the story gets even more intense from here. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will shock you. Asterisk, asterisk. That conversation with Jake was the moment I realized I was truly alone. Not just financially cut off from my family's legacy, but emotionally abandoned by people I'd spent my whole life trying to please. The grief was overwhelming, like mourning the death of people who were still alive. I was grieving the parents I thought I had, the family I thought I belonged to, the future I thought we'd share. But something else was growing alongside the grief: anger. Not the explosive, destructive kind, but a cold, focused fury that began to crystallize into determination. I'd spent 32 years trying to earn my parents' love and approval. I'd shaped my life around their expectations, made decisions based on their needs, defined my worth by their opinions. Now, for the first time, I was free from all of that. I started therapy, something I'd resisted for years because I didn't want to seem weak or needy. Dr. Martinez was a patient woman in her 50s who specialized in family trauma. During our first session, I told her the whole story, expecting her to be as shocked as everyone else had been. Instead, she nodded knowingly. "It's more common than you think," she said. "Some parents create a dynamic where one child is the identified problem who needs rescuing, and the other is the responsible one who's expected to manage without support. The tragedy is that both children suffer, just in different ways." Her words opened up a new way of seeing my childhood. I began to remember moments I'd forgotten or reframed over the years. The time I won a state writing competition and my parents missed the award ceremony because Jake had gotten suspended from school and needed their attention. The countless birthdays where my gifts were smaller and cheaper than Jake's because you don't need as much to be happy. The way family conversations always centered on Jake's problems, his needs, his dreams, while my achievements were acknowledged with a brief "good for you" before the focus shifted back to him. I realized I'd been trained from childhood to be the invisible child, the one who succeeded quietly so that all the family's energy could go toward managing Jake's chaos. I'd internalized this role so completely that I'd seen it as virtuous. I was proud of being low maintenance, of not being a burden, of taking care of myself. I'd never realized it was a survival strategy I'd developed to cope with emotional neglect. The therapy sessions were painful but liberating. I grieved not just for the recent betrayal, but for the childhood I'd never had, where my needs had mattered as much as my brother's. I grieved for all the times I'd minimized my own accomplishments to avoid making Jake look bad. I grieved for the exhausting vigilance of always trying to be perfect, enough to earn love that should have been unconditional. Meanwhile, life went on. I still had to go to work, pay rent, handle all the mundane details of adult existence, but now I was doing it with a new awareness of my own strength. I'd been supporting myself and thriving for years without my parents' help. I'd built a life, a career, relationships, all on my own merit. The skills and resilience that it made, my parents think I didn't need them, were actually proof that I was more capable than I'd ever realized. I started paying attention to my job in a new way. I worked as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized technology company, a position I'd fallen into after college and never really examined strategically. I was good at it, but I'd been coasting, doing enough to get by, but not pushing myself to excel. Now I had nothing to fall back on, except my own abilities, and that lit a fire under me that had been dormant for years. I began staying late, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand every aspect of how the business worked. I volunteered for projects that would stretch my skills. I started reading business books and industry publications. I signed up for online courses in digital marketing and data analysis. My supervisor noticed the change and called me into her office after a few months. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but keep it up. The work you did on the Johnson campaign was exceptional." The validation felt different than anything I'd experienced before. This praise was based purely on my performance, my ideas, my effort. Nobody was grading me on a curve or comparing me to anyone else. I was succeeding or failing entirely on my own merits, and for the first time in my life, that felt incredibly freeing. 6 months after the will meeting, I got a promotion. It came with a significant salary increase and the opportunity to lead my own team. I celebrated by taking myself out to an expensive dinner and buying a bottle of champagne. I thought about calling my parents to share the good news, an old habit that died hard. But I realized I didn't want to hear their lukewarm congratulations or their inevitable pivot to asking how Jake was doing. This achievement was mine, and I didn't need to share it with people who couldn't genuinely celebrate my success. That night, I got a text from my mother. "Heard about your promotion from Linda? That's nice, dear. Your father's been having some back trouble, and Jake's been such a help around the house." Even my professional success was just a backdrop for praising Jake's minimal contribution to their lives. I deleted the text without responding and blocked their number. It was time to stop allowing them access to hurt me. The next phase of my journey was about building the family I'd never had. I strengthened my friendships, investing time and energy in people who valued me for who I was rather than who they needed me to be. I started dating with new standards, looking for partners who saw me as an equal rather than someone to fix or manage. I volunteered at a literacy program, finding deep satisfaction in helping others learn skills that would improve their lives. Most importantly, I began to dream bigger than I ever had before. Without the safety net of family wealth, I couldn't afford to play it safe. I had to bet on myself completely, and that forced me to really examine what I was capable of. I started developing a business plan for a digital marketing consultancy. Using the skills I'd been building and the network I'd been cultivating, the idea had been percolating for months. I'd seen how many small businesses struggled with their online presence, and I knew I could help them. More than that, I knew I could build something from nothing, just like I'd been doing my whole life. The difference was that now I was doing it intentionally. With pride rather than resignation, I spent evenings and weekends researching the market, being service packages, creating marketing materials. It was exhausting but exhilarating work. Every small milestone felt like a victory. Registering the business name, designing a logo, landing my first client. These weren't accomplishments I was having to downplay or apologize for. No, they were mine, built with my own hands and mind. A year after starting the business as a side hustle, I was making enough money to consider leaving my corporate job. It was a terrifying prospect, giving up the security of a steady paycheck to bet everything on my own abilities. But I'd learned that security was an illusion anyway. The family I'd thought would always be there had abandoned me. The only security that mattered was the kind I could create for myself. The day I gave notice at my corporate job, my boss tried to talk me out of it. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Starting a business is risky, and you've got a good thing here. Why would you want to throw that away?" I understood her concern, but I also understood something she didn't. I'd already lost everything that could be taken away from me. Now I was building something that no one could steal, diminish, or redistribute based on their opinion of what I deserved. My business grew slowly but steadily. Each new client was a vote of confidence in my abilities. Successful campaign was proof that I could create value in the world without anyone else's permission or approval. I hired my first employee, then my second. I moved from my apartment to a small office space, started getting referrals from satisfied customers, who became advocates for my work. 2 years after the will meeting, I was running a profitable business with 6 employees. I was making more money than I'd ever earned in the corporate world. And more importantly, I was building something that reflected my values and vision. The work was challenging and meaningful in ways that my previous job had never been. It was around this time that I started hearing rumors about Jake's situation. Through my Aunt Linda, I learned that he'd dropped out of the management position at the family business after 6 months, claiming it was too stressful. He'd tried to sell the business but couldn't find buyers who were willing to meet his inflated asking price. The house that had been maintained by my parents' careful attention was showing signs of neglect under his ownership. He'd borrowed against it twice to fund various Gitrick schemes that had predictably failed. I felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing this news. There was some satisfaction, I won't lie, in seeing that my parents' favoritism hadn't actually helped Jake succeed. But there was also sadness for the family business that had been built over decades and was now being run into the ground. Was also, but we yelled. Despite everything, there was still a remnant of the protective instinct I'd developed toward Jake. Throughout our childhood, the call from my mother came on a Tuesday evening. I was working late in my office preparing for a presentation to a potential major client. When I saw her name on my phone, I hesitated before answering. We hadn't spoken since I'd blocked their numbers, though I'd never changed my work phone. Apparently she'd gotten that number from someone. Her voice was smaller than I remembered, tentative in a way that was completely unlike the confident. A woman who delivered my disinheritance 2 years earlier. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," she said, "but we need to talk. Things have gotten complicated with Jake and the business, and your father and I were hoping you might have some advice." The irony was stunning. After declaring that I didn't deserve their support because I was too capable and independent, they were now calling me precisely because of that capability and independence. I could hear the desperation under her careful politeness, and I knew that reaching out to me must have cost her significant pride. "What kind of advice?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. My mother launched into a complicated story about Jake's mismanagement, his debts, his increasingly erratic behavior. The family business was failing, the house needed major repairs that couldn't be afforded, and Jake had started blaming everyone else for his problems. "He says we set him up to fail by giving him too much responsibility," she said, "but we thought it was what he needed." I listened without comment as she painted a picture of the chaos that had followed their generous decision. Jake had interpreted their gift as validation of his entitlement rather than as a responsibility to build on their legacy. He'd made impulsive decisions, ignored expert advice, and treated the business as his personal piggy bank rather than as an entity that needed careful management to survive. "We were wondering," my mother continued, her voice getting even smaller. "If you might consider coming back to help sort things out. I know we haven't always been fair to you, and maybe we made some mistakes in how we handled the will situation. But you were always so good with business things, and Jake really needs guidance from someone he trusts." The request hung in the air between us like a bomb waiting to explode. After 2 years of silence, after being told I didn't deserve their support, after watching from a distance as Jake destroyed everything they'd built, they wanted me to come back and fix the mess. Not as an equal partner, not as a valued family member, but as the unpaid consultant who would solve their problems, and then presumably disappear again when things got stable. "I need some time to think about this," I told her. "I'll call you back." I hung up before she could respond, and sat staring at my computer screen, trying to process what had just happened. The vindication I'd expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, there was just a deep wariness at the predictability of it all. That weekend, I drove out to see the family business for myself. It was in a small commercial district where I'd spent countless hours as a teenager, learning the trade and dreaming of one day being trusted with real responsibilities. The building looked shabby, with peeling paint and a broken sign. Through the windows, I could see empty desks and outdated equipment. The parking lot that used to be full of customers' cars was almost empty. I sat in my car for a long time, remembering how proud I'd been to work there, how I'd imagined that my summers of dedication were building towards something meaningful. I'd pictured myself gradually taking on more responsibility, eventually becoming a partner, maybe even taking over when my parents retired. Those dreams seemed naive now, but they'd once felt so real and attainable. The next week I called my mother back. "I'll help," I said, "but not the way you're thinking. I'm not coming back to work for free while Jake continues to be treated as the heir apparent. If you want my help, we're going to do this as a business transaction. I'll assess the situation and give you a plan, but you'll pay my consulting rate. And Jake will have no authority over me or the process." The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know about how she'd imagined this going. She'd expected the same old dynamic, where I would sacrifice my time and energy to clean up Jake's mess out of family loyalty. The idea that I might charge for my services, that I might set boundaries around how I was treated, clearly hadn't occurred to her. "I suppose that's fair," she said finally, though her tone suggested she thought it was anything but fair. We agreed on a timeline and a fee structure. I would spend 2 weeks evaluating the business and the family's financial situation, then provide a comprehensive report with recommendations. What they did with that information would be up to them. Walking into that building for the first time in over 2 years felt like visiting a crime scene. Everything was exactly where I remembered it, but everything was also wrong. Files were disorganized, financial records were incomplete, and customer relationships that had taken decades to build had been damaged by Jake's neglect and poor decision-making. Jake himself was a revelation. Gone was the smug confidence he'd displayed during the will meeting. He looked tired and defensive, jumping between blaming external factors for the business's problems and making grandiose claims about his plans to turn things around. He clearly resented my presence, but couldn't argue with the necessity of it. "I don't know why they called you," he said during our first meeting. "I've got everything under control. We just hit a rough patch, that's all. Every business goes through this." But the numbers told a different story. The company was hemorrhaging money. Customers were jumping to competitors. Jake's innovative ideas had mostly involved expensive mistakes that had depleted their cash reserves. As I dug deeper into the situation, I realized the damage was even worse than my mother had indicated. Jake hadn't just mismanaged the business. He'd fundamentally misunderstood what made it successful in the first place. He'd alienated long-term customers by trying to upsell them services they didn't need. He'd fired experienced employees and replaced them with cheaper, less skilled workers. He'd taken on projects that the company wasn't equipped to handle, leading to costly failures and damaged relationships. The house wasn't in much better shape. What had been a well-maintained family home was now showing the effects of deferred maintenance and Jake's impulsive improvements that had been started but never finished. The roof leaked, the heating system was failing, and the kitchen renovation That Jake had begun enthusiastically the previous year was still just exposed drywall and disconnected appliances. My parents looked older than their years, worn down by stress and the growing realization that their golden child wasn't living up to their expectations. They'd spent the past 2 years watching their life's work crumble while maintaining the fiction that Jake just needed more time and support to succeed. The cognitive dissonance was clearly taking a toll on both of them. After 2 weeks of analysis, I had a complete picture of the disaster my family had created for themselves. The business could potentially be saved, but it would require significant changes, including bringing in outside investment and restructuring Jake's role. The house could be restored, but only if they were willing to take on debt or sell other assets to fund the repairs. More fundamentally, the family would need to confront the truth about Jake's capabilities and limitations. He wasn't a business leader, and continuing to pretend otherwise would only make the situation worse. He needed structure, supervision, and realistic expectations about what he could contribute. I presented my findings in a detailed report that laid out several options for moving forward. Option 1 was to sell everything and cut their losses, using the proceeds to fund a comfortable retirement and giving Jake a modest trust fund that he couldn't mismanage. Option 2 was to bring in a professional management company to run the business while Jake learned the industry from the ground up in a junior role. Option 3 was to reorganize everything under new leadership, with Jake as a minority partner with limited decision-making authority. What I didn't include was option 4, the one I knew they were hoping for, me coming back to fix everything while Jake remained in nominal control. That ship had sailed. I'd built my own life and my own business, and I wasn't going to sacrifice that to enable the same destructive family dynamics that shaped my childhood. The meeting where I presented the report was as uncomfortable as I'd expected. Jake was furious at the suggestion that he wasn't capable of running the business independently. My parents were shocked at how dire the financial situation had become, and everyone seemed surprised that I wasn't offering to personally solve their problems. "So you're just going to let the family business die?" Jake accused. "You could fix this if you wanted to. You have the skills and the resources, but you're choosing to let it fail out of spite." His attempt to guilt me might have worked too, years earlier, but I'd learned too much about myself and about them to fall for it now. "I'm not letting anything fail," I replied calmly. "I'm giving you options for success. What happens next is your choice, just like it's always been." The difference was that now I was being honest about what those choices actually entailed. Instead of pretending that Jake could succeed without acknowledging his limitations or putting in the necessary work, my mother tried a different approach. "We know we made mistakes with the will," she said. "Maybe we can revisit that decision. If you came back and helped us rebuild, we could make sure you were properly recognized for your contributions." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, but it also revealed how little they still understood about what had happened between us. "This was never about the money," I told her. "It was about being seen and valued for who I am, not just called in when you need someone to clean up a mess. I've built my own life. I'm not looking to trade that for a place in a family that only appreciates me when it's convenient." The conversation ended without resolution. I left my report with them and returned to my own business, which had continued to thrive during my brief absence. My employees had handled everything professionally, proving that the systems and culture I'd built were strong enough to survive without my constant presence. 3 months later, I got a call from the lawyer who'd handled my parents' original will. They'd decided to implement option 2 from my report, bringing in professional management while restructuring their finances. Jake would remain involved, but in a supervised role with clear limitations on his authority. It wasn't the outcome anyone had originally wanted, but it was the only realistic path forward. More surprisingly, they'd also revised their will. While Jake would still inherit the house and a portion of the business, I was now included as a beneficiary. It wasn't an equal split. Jake was still the favored child, but it was an acknowledgement of my value that hadn't existed before. The lawyer emphasized that this change had been Jake's idea, a claim I found difficult to believe, but chose not to question. A year later, I heard that the business was slowly stabilizing under professional management. Jake had initially chafed at the oversight, but had eventually settled into his new role. He was learning the industry properly for the first time. Some of his innovative ideas were actually working when they were properly researched and implemented. My parents seemed relieved to have the day-to-day stress removed from their lives, though they were still adjusting to the loss of control over their life's work. As for me, my business continued to grow. I'd expanded into new markets and was considering opening a second office. More importantly, I'd built a life surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not who they needed me to be. I was in a relationship with someone who saw my independence as a strength rather than a threat. I had friendships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The trauma of being disinherited had never fully healed, but it had transformed into something else, a deep appreciation for my own resilience and a clear understanding of my worth that nobody could take away from me. I'd learned that family isn't just the people you're born to, but the people who choose to love and support you unconditionally. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if my parents had made different choices in that living room 3 years ago. Would I have remained content in my corporate job, living a smaller life in service to other people's expectations? Would I have ever discovered what I was truly capable of building on my own? Would I have ever learned to value myself as much as I'd always valued their approval? The answer is that I'll never know, and I'm grateful for that uncertainty. The path I was forced onto was harder and scarier than the one I'd planned. But it led to a destination that was entirely my own. I'd built something from nothing, just like countless people before me who'd been told they weren't enough, weren't worthy, weren't deserving of the opportunities they'd have to create for themselves. In the end, my parents were right about one thing. I didn't need their support the way Jake did. But they were wrong about why that was something to be punished rather than celebrated. My independence wasn't a character flaw that excused their neglect. It was a strength that deserved recognition and respect. It took me 32 years and a devastating betrayal to fully understand that. But once I did, it changed everything. The last time I spoke to my mother, she mentioned that Jake had been asking about me, wondering if I might be willing to have dinner sometime to clear the air. I told her I'd think about it, and I have been. Forgiveness isn't the same thing as restoration. And healing doesn't require going back to relationships that were never healthy to begin with. I'm open to the possibility of a different kind. A relationship with my family, one based on who we are now, rather than the roles we played in the past. But if that never happens, I'll be okay. I've learned that the most important relationship I have is the one with myself. And that relationship is finally built on truth, instead of the desperate hope for approval that shaped so much of my early life. I know who I am, what I'm capable of, and what I deserve. That knowledge is worth more than any inheritance. It's something no one can ever take away from me. Asterisk, asterisk. What do you think about this family's choices? Have you ever experienced favoritism in your own family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible, true stories of overcoming adversity and finding strength in the most unlikely places. Your next inspiring story is just a click away. Asterisk, asterisk.